A second avalanche Whoomph. It was a sound that nobody who has ever heard it can forget, a massive avalanche. This one was much bigger than the first. Tons more snow came tumbling down the mountain, and before Hurlen Patano could even turn around, she was slammed in the back by a wall of white. She was tossed over Fuzak's head and carried another 20 feet downhill. Once again, she was only partially buried. Luckily, most of the snow had gone over her body and continued down the hill. After she freed herself, she looked up the mountain and was terrified to realize that the landscape had been completely transformed. There were massive new mounds of snow where before there had been none at all. All her points of reference had disappeared. Worst of all, there were no signs of Scott, Fuzak, or Kay. And Humphreys hadn't reappeared. This time her friends had truly been buried alive. When Ken Scott heard the roar, he immediately knew the unthinkable was happening, a second avalanche. I'm dead, he thought. While it didn't budge him from where he'd been trapped, there was so much more snow piled on him, 9 feet of it, that his world had gone completely black, completely silent. That wasn't the only difference. Now he was totally immobile, and the breathing space he'd cleared was gone. As he lay on his left side, snow pressed on him so heavily that he couldn't move anything but his eyelids beneath his goggles and his toes inside his boots. He couldn't even twitch a finger, let alone move his right arm as he'd been able to before. It was as if he'd been paralyzed, cemented in snow. Even worse, he couldn't expand his chest enough to take a full breath. He gasped for small gulps of air. Still, he knew what he had to do to try to survive a second time. First, he shut his eyes. He preferred seeing images in his mind to the empty darkness that surrounded him. He created a mental checklist of what he was still wearing, from head to toe. Hat, goggles, poles, gloves, boots, skis. That means there's nothing on the surface for rescuers to see. What about his friend Rebecca? Was she okay or was she buried too? He knew the patrols had no idea where they'd been skiing. She was the only person who could locate him. He also knew his chances of survival were small. He'd have a 90% chance of living if rescue came within 15 minutes, but only about 30% if he lay under the snow for 30 minutes. About 3/4 of avalanche victims die from asphyxia or suffocation. Don't miss this story about a teenager who saved a hiker that fell 75 feet off a mountain cliff. Gasping for air, he tried to fight back panic, but when he thought of his family, of his wife, Ruth, and his daughter, Tash, and the grandkids, he felt helpless, then doomed. This was not the way he wanted to die. His training had taught him that panicking was not only useless, but dangerous. It used up valuable air, yet he couldn't control his fear. He let out a mighty, anguished scream that no one would hear. Hurlen Patano unzipped her parka and pulled out her phone. She didn't have the number for ski patrol headquarters, but she did know some staffers' numbers. She called Ernie Silva, who happened to be a friend of Scott's. Hey, Ruby, he answered, using his nickname for her. Long time, no see. How? She cut him off. There's been an avalanche on 16-1, and Ken is in it. Bring help. Word spread quickly, and soon Silver Mountain's patrols and skiers were heading to the avalanche site with shovels and 10-foot poles with which they could probe for buried skiers. Not waiting for them, Hurlen Patano clambered over piles of snow to where she thought she had seen Scott and Fuzak before the second avalanche. Alone on the mountainside, she used her gloved hands to dig frantically at the hard-packed snow. Her friends' lives depended on her. Encased in the avalanche, Scott drifted between terror and panic. His rib cage compressed, he could take only tiny breaths, using his diaphragm to help him force in air. He fought to stay positive by focusing on his breathing, but then he'd try to move his head or a finger, and when he couldn't, he'd panic again. With so much more snow on top of him, he feared ski patrols wouldn't be able to locate him. His time was ticking away. He thought of his tight-knit group of friends who called themselves the Boys, 3 of whom were world-class skiers who had lost their lives in a massive avalanche at Tunnel Creek in Washington state in 2012. This is the end, he thought. I'm going to join the Boys. 10 minutes after the second avalanche, the slope was abuzz with some 50 rescuers, including red-coated ski patrols as well as volunteer skiers. Like a commander marshalling her troops, Hurlen Patano stayed calm and pointed out where she thought her friends were buried. Rescuers formed a horizontal line along the slope, each standing just 2 feet apart, and inserted their probes down into the deep, chunky snow, hoping to hit and locate the buried skiers. A first responder stood above the probe line and repeatedly called out, "Probe right, probe center, probe left, step forward." 40 minutes into the search, a rescuer shouted, "A strike." Bill Fuzak, unconscious but alive, was dug out of more than 9 feet of snow. Seeing his location, Hurlen Patano had a better idea of where Scott might be buried. She pointed to a spot some 10 feet farther up and, pumped with adrenaline, screamed at the rescuers, "There! Move there! Faster!" Scott, struggling to breathe, was frustrated. He knew that his 30-minute survival window had come and gone, and he had resigned himself to death. And, yet, he wasn't dying. Why was this dragging on so long? But a new sensation reassured him. It was a feeling of warmth that he knew was a sign of hypothermia. "I'll be asleep soon," he thought, "and this hell will be over." A miracle on the slopes. Then he felt a slight pressure on his right hip. A probe? He anxiously prayed to feel it again. A minute passed, then 2. Nothing. He'd been trained how to use a rescue probe, and he knew that if a rescuer hit something, they leave the probe in place as a marker. But the probe was gone and his flicker of hope vanished. "They've moved along the grid," he thought. "My 1 in a million chance." He felt himself fading away. Suddenly, a vibration. The pressure on his body seemed to be changing. Was that the sound of shovels hitting snow? He started shouting, hoping that anyone standing above would hear. It took rescuers 5 minutes to dig through the 9 feet of snow and uncover Scott's face, goggles still on. He gulped in deep breaths of fresh air and saw the gray sky above, along with 30 or 40 people standing over him smiling, while others continued to dig him free. He couldn't believe it. He had survived 2 avalanches. As his arms were freed, he spotted Hurlen Patano among his rescuers and pulled her down on top of him, almost squeezing the breath out of her. "Ken, you've got to let go," she told him as joy and relief filled her. "We have to get you out of here and get you help." He smiled and continued hugging her. "I can't let go." While Ken Scott, Bill Fuzak, and Warren Kayes survived, 3 others, including Carl Humphreys, lost their lives. Scott suffered no major injuries, although he and Hurlen Patano have suffered from a form of post-traumatic stress syndrome and received counseling to deal with it. His love of skiing undiminished. Just 9 days after his rescue, Scott was back skiing on Silver Mountain. We are producing videos on Tuesdays and Thursdays here on the channel. If you liked it, don't forget to leave your like and activate the notification bell to stay on top of all the news. I'll wait for you in the next video, but before leaving the channel, let me tell you, just one more story. I'll leave it at the end for you to click and watch.